One winter morning in Montana, during the coldest spell in American history, Evan Carter woke up with a start to see the thermometer on the porch reading minus 48 degrees. The air was so cold that every blade of grass and leaf was covered in ice, seemingly frozen in an eternal moment. Evan, a native Montanan, was used to the cold, but still shivered at the harshest temperature he had ever experienced. He poured himself a cup of hot coffee and turned on the TV to check the weather, but the howling wind outside pulled his attention away from the screen. Standing by the large window, looking out, he realized the wind was so strong that it was blowing thick layers of snow, swirling into white columns that danced and twisted like ghostly figures in a stormy ballet. But that's not all. Just when he thought the morning couldn't get more surreal, he dropped his cup of coffee in shock, the hot liquid splattering onto the floor unnoticed. Through the frosted glass, a sight he'd never expected greeted him. A scene so implausible it felt like a dream. A mother bobcat was crouched against the window frame, her golden brown fur streaked with frost, her sleek body trembling from the brutal cold. And listen to this, she wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 tiny bobcat cubs huddled together in a small mound of shivering snow-dusted fur, barely distinguishable against the endless white snow. Their small bodies shook violently, their thin mewling cries almost drowned out by the howling wind. The smallest of the cubs suddenly collapsed, its frail form twitching weakly as if it was on the brink of surrendering to the unforgiving elements. But it gets crazier. The mother bobcat, as if sensing the urgency and the narrowing gap of time, picked up the smallest cub by the scruff of its neck and brought it closer to the window. Her movements were purposeful yet gentle, every step filled with a mother's determination. She pressed its tiny body softly against the glass, her breath fogging the pain as she looked up at Evan, with eyes that radiated both desperation and hope, begging him to understand the silent plea for help. The wind howled even louder, slamming snowflakes against the window with sharp popping sounds that made the moment feel even more desperate. Evan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen anything like this before. The mother bobcat raised her paw and tapped on the window rhythmically, her claws clicking against the glass. It was as if she was trying to send him a message, pleading for him to understand. Evan hesitated. Bringing wild animals into his home was the last thing he ever imagined doing. But looking at the collapsed cub, he knew that if he didn't act, it might not survive the next few minutes. He walked shakily to the door, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty, and opened it slightly. But listen to this. The mother bobcat immediately brought the weak cub to the threshold and set it down gently, stepping back as if to show she wasn't a threat. Her eyes stayed locked on his, full of hope and desperation. He couldn't turn them away. Evan scooped up the tiny cub, its body barely warmer than the ice outside, and carried it inside. The mother bobcat watched intently, then pointed her gaze toward the 2 remaining cubs, still huddled in the snow. She looked up at him again, her pleading expression unmistakable. It gets worse. He opened the door wider, motioning for her to bring the other cubs. She didn't hesitate. One by one, she nudged the cubs toward him, her movements careful and deliberate. When all 3 cubs were inside, Evan hesitated again. The mother bobcat stood at the threshold, snow swirling around her as she waited for his permission. Finally he nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She moved gracefully but cautiously, shaking the ice off her fur before stepping fully into the warmth of the house. And here's where it gets really wild. She didn't act like a wild animal at all. She seemed to understand that she was a guest, staying close to her cubs, and even brushing against the furniture lightly, as if to test her surroundings. Evan quickly gathered blankets, folding and layering them near the fireplace to create a warm nest for the bobcat family. The mother bobcat wasted no time nudging the cubs toward the heat, carefully adjusting the blankets with her paws and snout to ensure her little ones were as comfortable as possible. But that's not all. She turned her gaze back to Evan, her amber eyes shining with an almost human gratitude that seemed to pierce straight to his soul. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, a connection he could neither explain nor deny. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, the wind howling like a pack of wolves in full hunt. But inside, The atmosphere began to soften, a sanctuary against the chaos. The cubs, once trembling and weak, started to stir. The smallest one, nestled closest to the fire, let out a tiny, pitiful mew, its first sound since arriving. The sound was so faint, yet it filled the room with hope. Evan watched in awe as the mother bobcat leaned down to lick each of her cubs in turn, her rough tongue methodically warming them and coaxing life back into their small forms. And listen to this. The cubs, despite their wild nature, displayed an astonishing level of calm. They stayed close to their mother, their wide, curious eyes darting occasionally toward Evan, but without a hint of fear. It was as if they understood they were safe, as if they trusted him completely. Time seemed to stretch as Evan observed the family. The firelight flickered across their fur, creating a warm, golden glow that contrasted sharply with the icy desolation outside. Every movement of the mother bobcat was deliberate and tender, her instincts finely tuned to protect and nurture her young. The smallest cub, now steadier on its paws, let out another soft sound, this one more confident, as it curled closer to its siblings. Evan couldn't tear his eyes away, feeling as though he were witnessing something both primal and profoundly sacred. The storm outside raged on, but inside, an unspoken truce and bond were forming. The mother bobcat glanced at Evan again, her gaze lingering this time, as if she wanted to convey her gratitude in a way words never could. Evan, still clutching the empty coffee mug he'd long forgotten about, felt a lump rise in his throat. How could an animal so wild, so inherently fierce, display such gentleness and understanding? The thought left him humbled, and he realized in that moment just how extraordinary this encounter truly was. As the hours passed, Evan found himself mesmerized by the scene. The mother bobcat, ever vigilant, kept one eye on her cubs and the other on him. Her demeanor spoke of trust, but also unyielding protection. It gets crazier. At one point, she stood up and walked over to the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped at the edge of the counter and looked back at him, her ears perked as if asking permission. Evan, understanding her silent request, grabbed a plate and placed a small piece of cooked chicken on it, setting it on the floor. She approached cautiously, sniffed the food, and then carried it back to her cubs, dividing it among them with the same deliberate care that defined all her actions. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Snow piled high against the windows, and the wind continued to howl like a relentless beast clawing at the house. But inside, the warmth from the fireplace and the unusual bond forming between man and beast created a surreal atmosphere. The flickering firelight seemed to weave a spell over the room, softening the edges of reality. It gets worse. Evan realized that by helping the bobcat family, he had taken on a responsibility far greater than he had anticipated. The fragility of life in the wild was suddenly very real to him. He couldn't just let them back out into the storm. They needed time to recover, and he was their only hope. Over the next few hours, the mother bobcat's behavior continued to amaze him. She was careful not to damage anything in the house, even using her paw to push a fallen blanket back onto the pile. The cubs, now more energetic, began to explore their surroundings. But here's the wild part. They didn't act like typical wild animals. They seemed to understand the boundaries of the space, staying close to the fireplace and refraining from climbing or scratching the furniture. Their small paws patted softly against the wooden floor, their movements cautious but curious, as if they too understood the sanctity of this temporary haven. Evan couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The intelligence and awareness of the mother bobcat were unlike anything he had ever seen. She even seemed to communicate with him through her body language, tilting her head or flicking her tail to express her needs. At one point, she turned to look at the smallest cub, who was struggling to keep up with its siblings. With a soft growl, she nudged it gently toward the warmth of the blankets, her maternal instinct evident in every gesture. But that's not all. When the storm finally began to weaken, the mother bobcat stood up and stretched, signaling that it was time for her family to leave. She nuzzled each of her cubs, encouraging them to follow her to the door. Evan opened it slowly, the cold air rushing in and making him shiver. The cubs hesitated at first, their tiny paws sinking into the snow, their soft cries lost in the still fierce wind. The mother bobcat gently nudged them forward, her patience and encouragement unwavering. And listen to this. Before stepping out, she turned back to Evan and placed her paw on his arm. The touch was brief but powerful, a moment of connection that transcended species. Her eyes, filled with gratitude, seemed to convey a heartfelt thank you that no words could match. The family of bobcats disappeared into the snowy forest, their forms blending seamlessly into the white landscape. Evan stood in the doorway, watching until they were out of sight. The silence that followed felt heavy, but not empty. The warmth they had brought into his home lingered long after they had gone, leaving him with a newfound appreciation for the incredible intelligence and emotions of the wild animals he had always admired from afar. The encounter stayed with him, a story he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. A story not just of survival, but of an extraordinary connection forged in the heart of a brutal winter.